in the heart of Rome, where ancient stones whisper secrets and shadows dance across marble floors, there exists a man whose power rivals that of kings, yet whose name remains largely unknown to the world. He wears no golden crown, delivers no grand speeches from ornate balconies, and never appears on the evening news. Yet within the corridors of the Vatican, his influence flows like an invisible current, shaping decisions that ripple across continents and through the lives of millions. They call him the Black Pope. Picture this. While the world watches the Pope in his white robes blessing crowds in St. Peter's Square, just steps away sits another figure in simple black attire, reviewing reports from over 100 countries, analysing global trends, and quietly coordinating a network that spans every inhabited continent on Earth. This is the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, and his reach extends far beyond what most people could ever imagine. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on one of history's most intriguing mysteries. We'll explore how a religious order founded nearly 5 centuries ago has managed to position itself at the crossroads of education, politics, and global influence. We'll examine why this man in black has been whispered about in the halls of power for generations, and why understanding his role might be the key to understanding how our modern world really operates. But before we dive deep into this labyrinth of influence and intrigue, we need to understand something crucial. This isn't a story about conspiracy theories or wild speculation. This is about documented history, verifiable connections, and patterns of influence that have been hiding in plain sight for hundreds of years. The story begins in 1540, during one of the most tumultuous periods in Christian history. The Protestant Reformation was tearing apart the religious unity of Europe. Martin Luther's ideas were spreading like wildfire, challenging the very foundation of Catholic authority. The Church was facing an existential crisis, and traditional methods of maintaining control were proving inadequate. Enter Ignatius of Loyola, a Spanish soldier whose life changed dramatically after a battlefield injury. During his recovery, this former knight didn't simply find religion, he reimagined it. Instead of creating another contemplative monastic order that would retreat from the world, Loyola designed something revolutionary, a religious army that would engage directly with secular power, education, and global affairs. The Society of Jesus, as it became known, was structured unlike any religious order before it. While monks traditionally took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to their local superior, Jesuits added something extraordinary: absolute obedience to their superior general, a figure who would command their order with military precision and strategic vision. From the very beginning, the Jesuits understood something that other religious orders had missed. In a rapidly changing world, the key to lasting influence wasn't just spiritual authority, it was intellectual dominance and strategic positioning. They didn't just want to save souls, they wanted to shape the minds that would shape the world. Think about this for a moment. While other religious groups focused on prayer and contemplation, the Jesuits immediately began establishing schools, universities, and educational networks. They didn't just teach religion, they taught science, mathematics, philosophy, languages, and politics. They trained not just priests, but the future leaders of nations. This educational approach wasn't accidental. It was a calculated strategy that would prove to be one of the most effective soft power operations in human history. By educating the children of nobility, merchants, and emerging political classes, the Jesuits ensured that their worldview would be embedded in the decision-making processes of governments across Europe and beyond. But here's where the story becomes truly fascinating. The Jesuits didn't just educate local populations, they became masters of cultural adaptation, learning languages, studying local customs, and integrating themselves into societies across the globe with an efficiency that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. When Portuguese and Spanish explorers sailed to Asia, Jesuit missionaries weren't far behind. But these weren't your typical evangelists. In China, they presented themselves as scholars, and scientists, winning the respect of the imperial court through their knowledge of astronomy and mathematics. In Japan, they adapted their message to local sensibilities, building relationships with powerful lords and samurai families. This global network wasn't just about spreading Christianity, it was about gathering information, building relationships, and creating channels of influence that extended far beyond any single nation's reach. Every Jesuit mission became, in effect, an intelligence outpost, sending detailed reports back to Rome about local politics, economic conditions, social structures, and strategic opportunities. The Superior General, sitting in his modest headquarters near the Vatican, became the center of a web that spanned continents. Unlike kings who ruled territories or generals who commanded armies, he commanded something far more powerful, a network of highly educated, strategically positioned individuals who shared a common loyalty and a unified vision. By the 17th century, this network had become so influential that European monarchs began to feel threatened. It wasn't that the Jesuits were overtly challenging royal authority, quite the opposite. They were becoming indispensable to it. Jesuit priests served as royal confessors, tutors to princes, and advisors on matters of state. They were present at treaty negotiations, involved in diplomatic missions, and consulted on questions of governance and policy. But this very indispensability created a paradox. The more essential the Jesuits became to the functioning of European power structures, the more those in power began to question whether they were truly in control of their own decisions. When a king's most trusted advisors, his children's teachers, and his spiritual counselors all shared loyalty to a single figure in Rome, who was really making the decisions? This question became so pressing that by the 18th century, one European nation after another began expelling the Jesuits from their territories. Portugal expelled them in 1759, France in 1764, Spain in 1767. The reasons given were often vague, concerns about their influence, their methods, their loyalty. But the underlying fear was clear. These rulers had come to believe that the Jesuits had become too powerful, too influential, too difficult to control. The culmination came in 1773 when Pope Clement XIV, under enormous pressure from European monarchs, officially dissolved the entire Society of Jesus. It should have been the end of the story. An organization that had grown too powerful had been dismantled by the very authorities it had served. But here's where the mystery deepens. The Jesuits didn't simply disappear. Instead, they seemed to vanish into the shadows, continuing their work under different names, in different capacities, through different channels. Their schools continued operating under new management. Their networks remained intact. Their influence persisted, even without official recognition. And then, in 1814, something remarkable happened. Pope Pius VII restored the Society of Jesus in its entirety. Officially, this was because the Church recognized the value of their educational and missionary work. But many historians suggest a different reason. By 1814, it had become clear that the Jesuits were too valuable to remain suppressed. Their knowledge, their networks, and their capabilities were simply too useful to abandon. This pattern of being simultaneously indispensable and threatening, of being officially disbanded yet continuing to operate, of being feared yet relied upon, would become the defining characteristic of Jesuit influence throughout the modern era. What makes this particularly intriguing is how this dynamic has evolved in our contemporary world. Today, we live in an era where traditional forms of power, military might, territorial control, resource monopolies, are being challenged by newer forms of influence based on information, networks, and ideological alignment. In this new landscape, the Jesuit model of power becomes even more relevant. Consider this. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, oversees an organization with operations in 112 countries. That's more than most multinational corporations, more than most intelligence agencies, and more than most international organizations. These aren't just religious outposts. They're universities that educate future leaders, research institutions that shape policy discussions, charitable organizations that influence humanitarian priorities, and social service networks that interact with the most vulnerable populations in society. Each of these touchpoints represents not just an opportunity to serve, but an opportunity to observe, to influence, and to shape outcomes. And here's what makes this particularly significant in our current moment. Unlike traditional power structures that operate through formal hierarchies and public accountability, the Jesuit network operates through personal relationships, shared values, and informal influence. It's a form of soft power that's incredibly difficult to track, regulate, or counter. Think about the implications of this. In a world where we're increasingly concerned about the influence of technology companies, foreign governments, and wealthy individuals on our democratic processes, we may be overlooking one of the oldest and most sophisticated influence networks still operating today. This isn't to suggest anything sinister or conspiratorial. The Jesuits are, by all accounts, genuinely committed to education, social justice, and humanitarian service. Their work in some of the world's most challenging environments has been exemplary. Their contributions to science, philosophy, and human knowledge have been immense. But influence is influence, regardless of intent. And when that influence operates through networks that span the globe, touch every level of society, and answer ultimately to a single individual who operates largely outside public scrutiny, it raises questions that go to the heart of how power really works in our interconnected world. As we continue this exploration, we're going to examine exactly how this network operates today. We'll look at the educational institutions that shape tomorrow's leaders, the humanitarian organizations that operate in conflict zones, the research centers that influence policy discussions, and the personal relationships that connect Jesuit-educated individuals across governments, corporations, and international organizations. We'll also explore the historical precedents that help us understand how this influence has been wielded in the past, the moments when it has come into conflict with other power structures, and the ways it has adapted to changing global circumstances. Most importantly, we'll try to answer the fundamental question that lurks beneath this entire discussion. In a world where power is increasingly complex and distributed, where influence often matters more than authority, and where the most important decisions are often made far from public view, who is really in charge? The man they call the Black Pope may hold the key to understanding not just how the Vatican really operates, but how power itself functions in our modern, interconnected world. And as we'll see, his influence extends far beyond the walls of any church or the pages of any religious text. This is just the beginning of our journey into the hidden mechanisms of global influence, where faith and strategy intertwine, where education becomes a form of soft conquest, and where the most powerful figures are often those we never see coming. The threads of this influence become visible when you start looking at the right places. Take a walk through the corridors of power in Washington, London, or Brussels, and you'll find something remarkable. An unusually high concentration of individuals who share a common educational background, not from the same university necessarily, but from institutions that share a particular approach to learning, leadership, and moral reasoning. Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. isn't just another prestigious institution. It's where future diplomats, intelligence officers, and policymakers learn to think about global affairs through a lens that emphasizes service, strategic thinking, and moral complexity. When these graduates move into positions of influence within the State Department, the CIA, or international organizations, they bring with them not just their individual talents, but a shared framework for understanding how the world works. This pattern repeats across the globe. In Manila, the Ateneo de Manila has produced presidents and Supreme Court justices. In Beirut, St. Joseph University has educated generations of Middle Eastern leaders. In São Paulo, The Pontifical Catholic University has shaped Brazil's intellectual and political elite. Each of these institutions operates independently, yet they're all connected by their Jesuit foundation and their commitment to a particular vision of education and leadership. But here's what makes this network particularly fascinating. It doesn't operate like a traditional conspiracy or secret society. There are no secret handshakes, no coded communications, no central command structure issuing orders. Instead, it functions through something far more subtle and arguably more powerful: shared values, mutual recognition, and informal networks of trust and cooperation. When a Jesuit-educated diplomat sits down with a Jesuit-educated business leader to discuss a development project in Central America, they don't need to coordinate their approach in advance. They already share a common understanding of how to balance competing interests, how to navigate complex moral questions, and how to think strategically about long-term outcomes. They speak the same intellectual language, even if they've never met before. This creates a form of soft coordination that's incredibly difficult for outsiders to detect or counter. There's no paper trail to follow, no organizational chart to decode, no financial flows to trace. The influence operates through personal relationships, professional networks, and shared assumptions about how the world should work. Consider how this plays out in practice. During the Cold War, while the world was divided into competing ideological camps, Jesuit institutions managed to maintain operations on both sides of the Iron Curtain. They had schools in communist Poland and capitalist America, in socialist Nicaragua and authoritarian Chile. Their ability to navigate these contradictions wasn't accidental. It was the result of a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain influence regardless of political circumstances. This adaptability has only become more valuable in our current era of rapid change and uncertainty. While traditional power structures struggle to keep pace with technological disruption, cultural shifts, and economic volatility, the Jesuit network has continued to position itself at the center of emerging trends and opportunities. Take the field of artificial intelligence, for example. As governments and corporations grapple with the ethical implications of machine learning and automated decision-making, who are they turning to for guidance? Often it's ethicists and philosophers from Jesuit universities who have been thinking about these questions for years. Their influence on AI governance isn't the result of any grand conspiracy. It's the natural outcome of being prepared for important conversations before they become urgent. The same pattern appears in climate policy, global health initiatives, refugee assistance, and international development. When crisis strikes and leaders need trusted advisors who can navigate complex moral and practical challenges, they often turn to individuals and institutions with Jesuit connections, not because of any formal alliance, but because these networks have spent centuries building expertise in exactly these kinds of situations. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of contemporary Jesuit influence: its relationship with secular power structures. Unlike previous eras when the Catholic Church was either aligned with or opposed to particular governments, today's Jesuit network operates in a more complex environment where religious and secular authorities often share common interests while maintaining formal independence. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, exemplifies this new dynamic. Unlike his predecessors who operated primarily within ecclesiastical circles, Sosa moves comfortably between religious and secular environments. He holds a doctorate in political science, has taught at major universities, and speaks fluently about economics, social policy, and international relations. When he meets with world leaders, the conversations aren't limited to religious matters. They cover the full spectrum of global challenges. This evolution reflects a broader shift in how influence operates in the modern world. Traditional hierarchies based on formal authority are giving way to networks based on expertise, relationships, and moral credibility. In this new landscape, the Jesuit model of power, distributed, adaptable, and based on long-term relationship building, becomes particularly effective. But this effectiveness raises important questions about accountability and transparency. When influence operates through informal networks rather than formal institutions, how do we ensure that it serves the public interest rather than narrow organizational goals? When decisions are shaped by conversations that happen behind closed doors between people who share common backgrounds and assumptions, how do we maintain democratic oversight? These aren't easy questions to answer, particularly because the Jesuit network has generally used its influence for purposes that most people would consider beneficial. Their schools provide excellent education to millions of students. Their humanitarian work saves lives in some of the world's most difficult environments. Their research contributes to our understanding of complex global challenges. Yet the very benevolence of their activities makes their influence more difficult to scrutinize. It's hard to criticize an organization that's feeding refugees, educating the poor, and working for social justice. But influence is influence, regardless of how it's used, and concentrated influence, even when wielded with good intentions, can distort democratic processes and limit the range of policy options that receive serious consideration. This dynamic becomes particularly complex when we consider how Jesuit influence intersects with other powerful networks in our globalized world. The worlds of international finance, technology, media, and governance are increasingly interconnected, with the same individuals often moving between different sectors throughout their careers. When many of these individuals share common educational backgrounds and intellectual frameworks, it can create echo chambers that reinforce particular worldviews while marginalizing alternative perspectives. For instance, when international organizations design humanitarian interventions, economic development programs, or conflict resolution initiatives, the planning often involves individuals from Jesuit institutions working alongside colleagues from other elite educational backgrounds. While this brings together impressive expertise and experience, it can also lead to solutions that reflect the assumptions and blind spots of a relatively narrow intellectual community. The challenge becomes even more complex when we consider the global nature of contemporary challenges. Climate change, pandemic response, economic inequality, and technological governance all require coordination across national boundaries and between different sectors of society. In this environment, informal networks that can operate across traditional institutional boundaries become incredibly valuable. But they also concentrate influence in ways that may not align with democratic principles or diverse representation. This is where the figure of the Black Pope becomes particularly significant. As the head of a global network that spans educational institutions, humanitarian organizations, research centers, and informal influence networks, the Superior General occupies a unique position in the global power structure. He's not elected by any democratic process, doesn't report to any public institution, and operates largely outside the scrutiny that we apply to other forms of concentrated power. Yet his decisions about where to deploy Jesuit resources, which issues to prioritize, and how to position the organization in relation to contemporary challenges can have far-reaching consequences. When the Jesuits decide to focus on climate change, it doesn't just affect their own activities, it influences the broader conversation through their educational institutions, research centers, and the networks of alumni who carry Jesuit perspectives into positions of influence throughout society. This isn't to suggest that there's anything necessarily problematic about this influence. Many of the priorities that emerge from Jesuit institutions, social justice, environmental stewardship, education for the marginalized, align with widely shared values. But the concentration of influence in any single network, regardless of its intentions, raises questions about pluralism, accountability, and democratic governance that we're only beginning to grapple with. As we move deeper into this exploration, we'll examine specific cases where Jesuit influence has shaped outcomes in ways that might not be immediately obvious. We'll look at how their educational networks have influenced policy debates, how their humanitarian work has intersected with geopolitical interests, and how their research institutions have shaped our understanding of everything from economics to international relations. We'll also explore the mechanisms through which this influence operates, the conferences that bring together Jesuit-educated leaders, the research collaborations that span continents, the informal networks that connect alumni across different sectors and countries. Most importantly, we'll try to understand how these mechanisms have evolved to remain effective in an era of rapid change and increasing scrutiny of concentrated power. The story of the Black Pope isn't just about one man or one organization. It's about how influence really works in our interconnected world, how informal networks can shape outcomes as effectively as formal institutions, and how power can be both everywhere and nowhere at once. As we continue this journey, we'll discover that understanding this hidden influence may be essential to understanding how our world really operates and who's really making the decisions that shape our collective future. The threads of this influence become even more intriguing when we examine how they've woven themselves into the fabric of modern intelligence gathering and geopolitical strategy. Picture this scenario. While world leaders debate policy in public forums, a parallel conversation is taking place in conference rooms, university halls, and charitable foundations around the globe. The participants aren't wearing diplomatic credentials or carrying official titles, yet their discussions often prove more consequential than formal negotiations. This shadow diplomacy operates through what intelligence professionals call soft channels, informal networks that can communicate across hostile borders, navigate cultural barriers, and maintain dialogue when official relations break down. And at the center of many of these channels, you'll find individuals connected to the Jesuit network. Consider how this played out during some of the most tense moments of the Cold War. While American and Soviet officials glared at each other across negotiating tables, Jesuit priests were quietly maintaining educational and humanitarian operations in both camps. They weren't spies in any traditional sense, but their unique position allowed them to observe, understand, and sometimes influence developments that purely secular organizations couldn't access. A Jesuit running a university in Eastern Europe might host academic exchanges that brought together scholars from both sides of the Iron Curtain. A priest working in refugee camps might facilitate communications between separated families. A philosopher at a Jesuit institution might publish papers that reframed ideological conflicts in ways that opened space for dialogue. None of these activities violated any laws or treaties, yet collectively they created channels of communication and influence that operated entirely outside official diplomatic structures. This capability has only grown more valuable in our current era of complex multilateral challenges. When traditional diplomacy fails, when governments can't be seen talking to each other, when official channels are blocked by political considerations, these informal networks often provide the only path forward. Take the ongoing challenges in the Middle East, for example. While governments struggle to find common ground between competing religious and ethnic groups, Jesuit institutions have maintained educational and humanitarian operations that serve all communities. Their ability to work with Christians, Muslims, and secular authorities simultaneously gives them a unique perspective on regional dynamics and sometimes allows them to facilitate dialogue that would be impossible through official channels. But this raises a fascinating question about the nature of sovereignty and accountability in our interconnected world. When a network of religious institutions can maintain influence across national boundaries, operate in conflict zones where governments have limited control, and facilitate communications that bypass official diplomatic channels, what does that mean for traditional concepts of state authority? The answer becomes even more complex when we consider how these networks intersect with modern technology and global communications. Today's Jesuit network isn't just connected through personal relationships and institutional ties. It's linked by sophisticated information systems that allow real-time coordination across continents. When a crisis erupts in Southeast Asia, Jesuit institutions around the world can quickly share information, coordinate responses, and mobilize resources in ways that often outpace official humanitarian agencies. This capability was dramatically demonstrated during the COVID-19 pandemic, when Jesuit educational and healthcare networks provided some of the most rapid and effective responses to the crisis, particularly in underserved communities. But speed and effectiveness aren't the only considerations. The ability to coordinate rapid responses to global challenges also represents a form of power that operates largely outside democratic oversight. When a small group of well-connected individuals can mobilize resources and shape outcomes across multiple countries simultaneously, it raises questions about who's really making decisions about global priorities and resource allocation. This dynamic becomes particularly visible when we examine how Jesuit networks have positioned themselves at the intersection of technology and social policy. As artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital communications reshape our world, the questions we face aren't just technical, they're fundamentally moral and philosophical. Who gets to make decisions about how these technologies are developed and deployed? What values should guide their implementation? How do we balance innovation with ethical considerations? These are exactly the kinds of questions that Jesuit institutions have been exploring for decades. Their combination of technological expertise and moral philosophy makes them natural participants in these discussions. But their participation isn't neutral. It reflects particular assumptions about human nature, social organization, and moral reasoning that shape the conclusions they reach. When tech companies seek ethical guidance, when governments develop AI governance frameworks, when international organizations create technology policy, they often turn to experts from institutions with Jesuit connections. Not because of any conspiracy, but because these institutions have invested heavily in developing expertise at the intersection of technology and ethics. The result is that Jesuit perspectives on technology governance, emphasizing human dignity, social responsibility, and long-term thinking, become embedded in policies and practices that affect billions of people. Again, these may be excellent values to prioritize, but the process by which they become dominant operates largely outside public awareness or democratic deliberation. This pattern extends beyond technology into virtually every area of global governance. When international organizations need experts on migration policy, they often draw from Jesuit institutions that have been working with refugee populations for decades. When corporations need guidance on sustainable development, they frequently consult with Jesuit research centers that have been studying environmental issues for years. When governments face complex social challenges, they regularly seek advice from Jesuit-educated policy experts who bring both analytical skills and moral frameworks to their recommendations. The cumulative effect is that Jesuit perspectives become woven into the fabric of global governance in ways that are difficult to trace or challenge. It's not that these perspectives are necessarily wrong or harmful. Many of them align with widely shared values about human dignity, social justice, and environmental stewardship. But the process by which they become influential operates through informal networks rather than transparent democratic deliberation. This brings us to one of the most significant aspects of contemporary Jesuit influence: its role in shaping how we think about global challenges rather than just how we respond to them. The most powerful form of influence isn't telling people what to do. It's shaping how they understand what needs to be done. Jesuit educational institutions don't just teach students facts and skills, they teach them frameworks for analyzing complex problems, making moral judgments, and thinking about their responsibilities to society. These frameworks become part of how students approach challenges throughout their careers, influencing decisions in ways that may not be immediately visible, but can be profoundly consequential over time. When a Jesuit-educated diplomat negotiates a trade agreement, their approach will be influenced by how they learned to think about economic justice and human dignity. When a business leader makes decisions about labor practices or environmental impact, their choices will reflect moral frameworks developed during their education. When a scientist decides which research questions to pursue, their priorities will be shaped by how they learn to think about the relationship between knowledge and social responsibility. This kind of influence is incredibly difficult to measure or counter because it operates at the level of assumptions and values rather than explicit commands or requirements. It's not that anyone is being told what to think. Rather, they're being given tools for thinking that inevitably shape the conclusions they reach. The sophistication of this approach becomes clear when we examine how Jesuit institutions have adapted to changing global circumstances over the centuries. Rather than clinging to outdated methods or resisting new developments, they've consistently positioned themselves at the forefront of emerging trends and challenges. During the colonial era, they were among the first to master local languages and customs in distant lands. During the scientific revolution, they contributed to advances in astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. During the Industrial Revolution, they established educational institutions that helped train the professional classes needed for modern economies. During the Cold War, they navigated ideological divisions while maintaining global networks, and today, they're positioning themselves at the center of discussions about artificial intelligence, climate change, and global governance. This adaptability isn't accidental. It reflects a sophisticated understanding of how influence works over long time periods. Rather than trying to control specific outcomes in the short term, the Jesuit approach focuses on positioning their network to remain relevant and influential regardless of how circumstances change. This long-term perspective gives them significant advantages over other forms of organized influence. Political movements rise and fall with electoral cycles. Corporate strategies shift with market conditions. Government policies change with administrations. But educational institutions and the networks they create can maintain influence across decades and centuries, adapting to new circumstances while preserving core elements of their approach. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, embodies this long-term strategic thinking. Rather than focusing primarily on immediate challenges, he's positioned the Jesuit network to play key roles in shaping how humanity responds to the fundamental transitions of our era: the shift to renewable energy, the development of artificial intelligence, the management of global migration, the governance of emerging technologies. His influence operates not through direct commands, but through strategic positioning. By ensuring that Jesuit institutions are conducting cutting-edge research on these issues, educating the next generation of leaders who will address them, and providing forums for dialogue between different stakeholders, he's helping to shape how these challenges will be understood and addressed for decades to come. This represents a form of power that's both more subtle and potentially more consequential than traditional forms of political or economic influence. It's the power to shape the agenda, to determine which questions get asked, which approaches get serious consideration, and which values guide decision-making processes. As we continue our exploration of this hidden influence, we'll examine specific cases where this agenda-setting power has shaped outcomes in ways that might surprise you. We'll look at how Jesuit networks have influenced major policy debates, shaped international responses to global challenges, and positioned themselves at the center of emerging fields of knowledge and practice. Most importantly, we'll grapple with the fundamental questions these patterns raise about power, accountability, and democratic governance in our interconnected world. When influence operates through networks rather than institutions, when power flows through relationships rather than formal hierarchies, when the most important decisions are often made through conversations rather than votes, how do we ensure that diverse voices are heard and democratic values are preserved? The answers to these questions may determine not just how we understand the role of the Black Pope and his network, but how we navigate the complex challenges of governing our interconnected, rapidly changing world. The story we're uncovering isn't just about one organization or one individual. It's about the evolution of power itself in the 21st century. The shadows cast by this network grow longer when we examine how they've learned to navigate the most sensitive corridors of power during moments of global crisis. there's a particular skill that sets apart truly sophisticated influence operations from crude attempts at manipulation. The ability to be present during pivotal moments without appearing to direct them, to shape outcomes while remaining invisible to historical scrutiny. Consider what happened during some of the most consequential events of the past century. When the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed, when apartheid ended in South Africa, when peace accords were signed in various conflict zones around the world. If you dig deep enough into the background of these events, you'll often find something intriguing. Key figures who helped facilitate dialogue, provided neutral meeting spaces, or offered moral frameworks for reconciliation, often had connections to Jesuit institutions. This isn't coincidence, and it isn't conspiracy. It's the result of deliberate positioning over decades and centuries. By maintaining educational and humanitarian operations in diverse political environments, by training individuals who can navigate complex moral and political terrain, and by building networks that transcend national and ideological boundaries, the Jesuit system has created what intelligence professionals might call persistent access to critical decision-making processes. Think about what this means in practical terms. When a government needs to establish back-channel communications with an adversary, when a corporation needs to navigate complex ethical terrain in a foreign market, when an international organization needs trusted intermediaries to facilitate sensitive negotiations, they often turn to individuals and institutions with the credibility, expertise, and global reach to operate effectively in ambiguous situations. The Jesuit network has spent centuries building exactly these capabilities. Their priests and alumni don't just understand theology, they understand psychology, economics, political science, and cultural dynamics. They don't just serve local communities, they maintain relationships that span continents and cross traditional boundaries between sectors and institutions. This global perspective becomes particularly valuable during periods of rapid change and uncertainty. While other organizations struggle to adapt to new circumstances, the Jesuit network can draw on centuries of experience navigating political upheavals, cultural transformations, and technological disruptions. They've seen empires rise and fall, ideologies come and go, technologies emerge and evolve. This historical perspective gives them a unique ability to maintain long-term strategic thinking, even during short-term crises. But perhaps most importantly, they've mastered something that many other influence networks struggle with: the art of being useful without being threatening. Unlike military forces that can be seen as aggressive, or economic powers that can be viewed as exploitative, or political movements that can be perceived as destabilizing, educational and humanitarian networks are generally welcomed even by suspicious governments and wary populations. This creates opportunities for influence that simply aren't available to other types of organizations. A Jesuit university can operate in countries where American corporations are banned, Western NGOs are restricted, and foreign governments are viewed with suspicion. A humanitarian mission can work in conflict zones where official diplomats can't travel and traditional media can't report. An educational exchange can bring together individuals who couldn't meet through any other mechanism. The cumulative effect is a form of global reach that surpasses many traditional forms of power. While armies can only project force to certain distances, while corporations can only operate where markets and regulations permit, while governments can only act within their jurisdictions, the Jesuit network can maintain presence and influence virtually anywhere human communities exist. This reach has only expanded with modern communications technology. Today's Superior General doesn't just receive reports from distant outposts through slow mail delivery. He can communicate in real time with Jesuit operations around the world, coordinate rapid responses to emerging crises, and maintain awareness of developing situations that might not reach mainstream media attention for weeks or months. The intelligence value of this global network is difficult to overstate. When you have trusted observers in over 100 countries, many of them operating in sensitive environments where few outsiders have access, you develop a perspective on global affairs that few other organizations can match. You understand not just what's happening, but why it's happening, who the key actors really are, and what the underlying dynamics suggest about future developments. But this intelligence isn't just gathered. It's analyzed through sophisticated frameworks developed over centuries of global engagement. Jesuit institutions don't just collect information. They interpret it through lenses that consider historical patterns, cultural contexts, moral implications, and strategic possibilities. This analytical capability transforms raw intelligence into actionable insights that can inform decision-making at the highest levels. The question that emerges from all of this is whether we're looking at something that enhances global governance or something that circumvents it. On one hand, the ability to maintain dialogue across hostile boundaries, to provide neutral spaces for difficult conversations, and to offer moral frameworks for complex decisions, clearly serves important public purposes. Many conflicts have been resolved, many humanitarian crises have been addressed, and many social challenges have been tackled more effectively because of the capabilities this network provides. On the other hand, when a single organization can maintain influence across so many boundaries and sectors, when its perspectives can shape outcomes without being subject to democratic oversight, when its priorities can influence resource allocation and policy development without transparent public deliberation, it raises fundamental questions about accountability and representation in global governance. These questions become even more complex when we consider how this network intersects with other forms of concentrated power in our contemporary world. The relationships between Jesuit institutions and major corporations, between Jesuit alumni and government agencies, between Jesuit research centers and international organizations, create webs of influence that are incredibly difficult to map or regulate. Take the world of international development, for example. When major foundations decide where to allocate billions of dollars in charitable giving, when international banks determine which projects to finance, when government agencies design foreign aid programs, the decision-making processes often involve individuals with connections to Jesuit institutions. Not because of any formal coordination, but because these institutions have produced many of the experts who specialize in exactly these kinds of complex, cross-cultural challenges. The result is that Jesuit perspectives on development, emphasizing human dignity, local participation, long-term sustainability, and social justice, become embedded in programs that affect millions of people around the world. Again, these may be excellent principles to prioritize, but the process by which they become dominant operates through informal networks rather than transparent democratic deliberation. Similar patterns appear in fields ranging from healthcare policy to environmental regulation to technology governance. In each case, the combination of expertise, moral credibility, and global reach that characterizes Jesuit institutions makes them natural participants in policy development processes. But their participation isn't neutral. It reflects particular worldviews and priorities that shape outcomes in ways that may not be immediately visible. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of contemporary Jesuit influence: its relationship with emerging forms of global governance. As traditional nation-state authority becomes less effective at addressing transnational challenges, new forms of coordination are emerging that operate through networks of experts, international organizations, and civil society groups. In this evolving landscape, the Jesuit network's combination of global reach, moral authority, and technical expertise positions it to play increasingly important roles in addressing challenges that transcend traditional boundaries. Climate change doesn't respect national borders. Pandemic diseases spread through global transportation networks. Technological developments affect societies worldwide. Economic instability in one region can cascade through interconnected financial systems. Addressing these challenges requires coordination mechanisms that can operate across traditional boundaries between nations, sectors, and institutions. The Jesuit network, with its centuries of experience in exactly this kind of cross-boundary coordination, is naturally positioned to help develop and implement these new forms of global governance. But this positioning also means that Jesuit perspectives on how global governance should work, who should participate, what principles should guide decision-making, how conflicts should be resolved, will likely have disproportionate influence on the institutions and processes that emerge to address 21st century challenges. This influence operates not just through direct participation in policy development, but through the education of future leaders who will inherit responsibility for global governance. Every year, thousands of students graduate from Jesuit institutions, carrying with them not just knowledge and skills, but frameworks for thinking about leadership, responsibility, and social organization that will influence their approach to challenges throughout their careers. When these graduates move into positions of influence in governments, corporations, international organizations, and civil society groups, they bring with them shared assumptions about how complex problems should be approached, how diverse stakeholders should be engaged, and how competing values should be balanced. These shared assumptions create informal coordination mechanisms that can be more powerful than formal treaties or organizational structures. The sophistication of this approach becomes clear when you consider how it's evolved to address contemporary challenges. Rather than trying to impose solutions from above, the Jesuit network focuses on shaping how problems are understood and how solutions are developed. Rather than seeking direct control over specific outcomes, it positions itself to influence the processes through which outcomes are determined. This represents a form of metapower, the power to shape how power itself is exercised. And in our rapidly changing world, where traditional forms of authority are being challenged and new forms of coordination are emerging, this kind of metapower may be more consequential than traditional forms of political or economic control. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, understands this dynamic clearly. His approach to leadership reflects not just traditional religious authority, but sophisticated thinking about how influence operates in complex, networked systems. He doesn't need to issue commands to shape outcomes. He can influence the development of frameworks that others will use to make decisions. This meta-approach to power explains why the Jesuit network has remained influential across so many different historical periods and political systems. Rather than depending on any particular configuration of power, it focuses on maintaining relevance to whatever configurations emerge. Rather than aligning with specific ideologies or interests, it positions itself to offer value to diverse stakeholders regardless of their particular perspectives. But this adaptability also makes the network's influence more difficult to understand and assess. When power operates through shifting networks rather than stable institutions, when influence flows through relationships rather than formal hierarchies, when the most important decisions emerge from conversations rather than votes, traditional mechanisms for accountability and oversight become inadequate. As we move deeper into the 21st century, these questions about networked power and distributed influence will likely become more rather than less important. The challenges we face, from climate change to artificial intelligence to global inequality, require forms of coordination that transcend traditional boundaries and authorities. The organizations and networks that can facilitate this coordination will wield enormous influence over how humanity responds to its greatest challenges. The Jesuit network, with its centuries of experience in exactly this kind of boundary-spanning coordination, is positioned to play a central role in these developments. But whether this influence serves broader public interests or narrower organizational goals depends on questions of accountability, transparency, and democratic participation that we're still learning how to address. The man in black who sits quietly in Rome, reviewing reports from around the world and shaping strategies that will influence global affairs for decades to come, represents both the promise and the peril of networked power in our interconnected age. Understanding how his influence operates may be essential to ensuring that the governance systems we develop for our shared future serve the diverse interests of all humanity rather than the particular perspectives of any single network, no matter how well-intentioned or historically significant. The story continues to unfold in conference rooms and classrooms, in humanitarian missions and research laboratories, in quiet conversations between individuals who share common educational backgrounds and moral frameworks. And as it unfolds, the question of who really governs our interconnected world becomes both more complex and more urgent with each passing day. The threads of this hidden influence become even more fascinating when we examine how they've learned to navigate the most treacherous waters of modern geopolitics. There's something almost supernatural about how this network manages to maintain operations in places where other organizations fear to tread, where governments have collapsed, where traditional diplomacy has failed completely. Picture this scenario. A civil war tears apart a nation in Africa. International corporations evacuate their personnel. Foreign embassies close their doors. Aid organizations pull out their staff. The media struggles to maintain correspondence in the chaos. Yet somehow, through it all, a small school continues operating in the countryside. A clinic keeps treating patients in the capital. A research station maintains its work, documenting what's really happening on the ground. The people running these operations don't wear uniforms or carry diplomatic passports. They're not protected by military escorts or international treaties. Yet they possess something that proves more valuable than any of these traditional protections. A reputation for neutrality, a commitment to serving local populations regardless of political circumstances, and most importantly, relationships that transcend the immediate conflict. This isn't just admirable humanitarian work, though it certainly is that. It's also an intelligence goldmine. When you're the only outside organization still operating in a collapsed state, when local populations trust you enough to share what they're really experiencing, when you can maintain communications with the outside world from places that have become black holes for traditional information gathering, you develop insights that no amount of satellite imagery or electronic surveillance can provide. But here's what makes this particularly intriguing. The information gathered through these humanitarian operations doesn't just stay within religious circles. It flows through networks that connect educational institutions, research centers, policy think tanks, and ultimately the corridors of power where critical decisions get made about international responses to crisis situations. Think about the implications of this. When world leaders need to understand what's really happening in a conflict zone, when international organizations are designing humanitarian interventions, when corporations are assessing risks in unstable regions, they often find themselves relying on information that ultimately traces back to these seemingly modest educational and humanitarian operations. The sophistication of this information network becomes clear when you consider how it's evolved to address contemporary security challenges. Traditional intelligence gathering focuses on governments, military forces, and formal political structures. But in our current era, many of the most significant threats come from non-state actors, informal networks, and social movements that operate below the radar of conventional surveillance. Understanding these emerging threats requires a different kind of intelligence: cultural intelligence, social intelligence, the kind of deep local knowledge that can only be developed through years of patient engagement with communities. And this is exactly the kind of intelligence that educational and humanitarian networks naturally develop through their day-to-day operations. When a Jesuit priest working in a refugee camp notices changes in the stories people tell about why they fled their homes, that information might reveal emerging patterns of conflict before they show up in official reports. When a teacher at a Jesuit school observes shifts in student attitudes toward authority or intergroup relations, those observations might predict social tensions before they explode into violence. When a researcher at a Jesuit university tracks economic or environmental changes in rural communities, that data might identify emerging sources of instability before they threaten regional security. None of this information gathering violates any laws or ethical standards. These individuals are simply doing their jobs, teaching, healing, researching, serving local communities. But the aggregate effect is a global awareness system that can detect emerging challenges earlier and understand them more deeply than traditional intelligence operations. This capability has become particularly valuable as the nature of global threats has evolved. The challenges that keep world leaders awake at night aren't primarily military invasions or terrorist attacks. They're complex, slow-moving crises like climate change, mass migration, economic inequality, and social fragmentation. Understanding and responding to these challenges requires exactly the kind of long-term, culturally embedded intelligence that educational and humanitarian networks naturally provide. But this raises profound questions about the relationship between knowledge and power in our interconnected world. When a single network can maintain global awareness capabilities that rival those of major intelligence agencies, when that network operates largely outside traditional oversight mechanisms, when its priorities and perspectives shape how global challenges are understood and addressed, what does that mean for democratic governance and public accountability? The current Superior General doesn't just oversee a religious organization. He sits at the center of what might be the world's most sophisticated early warning system for emerging global challenges. The reports that flow to his desk don't just describe religious activities. They provide real-time intelligence on political developments, economic trends, social movements, and environmental changes from every corner of the planet. This global awareness translates into strategic advantages that are difficult for other organizations to match. While governments struggle to understand rapidly changing situations in distant regions, while corporations attempt to assess risks in unfamiliar markets, while international organizations try to design effective interventions in complex environments, the Jesuit network often possesses insights that can inform more effective strategies and avoid costly mistakes. But knowledge isn't just gathered. It's actively shaped and interpreted through frameworks that reflect particular worldviews and priorities. The lens through which global challenges are understood inevitably influences the solutions that appear most reasonable and attractive. When that lens is shaped by centuries of religious thinking, particular approaches to moral reasoning, and specific assumptions about human nature and social organization, it creates systematic biases that can influence outcomes in ways that aren't immediately visible. Consider how this plays out in contemporary policy debates. When international organizations design responses to refugee crises, when governments develop strategies for addressing economic inequality, when corporations create frameworks for social responsibility, the experts they consult often bring perspectives shaped by Jesuit educational experiences. These perspectives emphasize human dignity, social solidarity, and long-term thinking, values that most people would endorse. But they also reflect particular assumptions about the proper role of institutions, the nature of social change, and the relationship between individual liberty and collective responsibility. The result is that certain approaches to global challenges become more likely to receive serious consideration, while others are marginalized or ignored entirely. This isn't the result of any deliberate conspiracy. It's the natural outcome of having policy debates shaped by individuals who share common intellectual and moral frameworks developed through similar educational experiences. This dynamic becomes particularly significant when we consider how global governance is evolving to address 21st century challenges. Traditional international law and diplomacy were designed for a world of sovereign nation-states dealing with clearly defined problems. But climate change doesn't respect national borders. Pandemic diseases spread through global transportation networks. Economic instability cascades through interconnected financial systems. Technological developments affect societies worldwide. Addressing these transnational challenges requires new forms of coordination that operate through networks of experts, international organizations, and civil society groups. In this emerging landscape, organizations that can provide trusted expertise, facilitate dialogue between diverse stakeholders, and offer moral frameworks for complex decisions become increasingly influential. The Jesuit network, with its combination of global reach, technical expertise, and moral authority, is naturally positioned to play central roles in these new forms of global governance. But this positioning also means that Jesuit perspectives on how global coordination should work, who should participate, what principles should guide decision-making, how conflicts should be resolved, will likely have disproportionate influence on the institutions and processes that emerge. This influence operates not just through direct participation in policy development, but through the education of future leaders who will inherit responsibility for global governance. Every year, thousands of students graduate from Jesuit institutions carrying with them not just knowledge and skills, but frameworks for thinking about leadership, responsibility, and social organization that will influence their approach to challenges throughout their careers. The sophistication of this educational influence becomes clear when you examine how Jesuit institutions have positioned themselves at the forefront of emerging fields of study. They weren't just early adopters of computer science. They were pioneers in thinking about the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. They didn't just establish business schools, they developed frameworks for thinking about corporate social responsibility. They didn't just create international relations programs, they pioneered approaches to conflict resolution and peace building. This pattern of being present at the creation of new fields of knowledge and practice ensures that Jesuit perspectives become embedded in the foundational assumptions of emerging disciplines. When these disciplines mature and their insights are applied to real-world challenges, they carry with them intellectual DNA that traces back to Jesuit institutions and the worldviews they promote. The cumulative effect is a form of intellectual influence that operates across generations and disciplines. The frameworks developed in Jesuit classrooms today will shape how tomorrow's leaders understand and respond to challenges that may not even be visible yet. The moral reasoning taught in Jesuit ethics courses will influence decisions made in corporate boardrooms, government offices, and international organizations decades from now. But perhaps most significantly, the networks of relationships formed in Jesuit educational environments will create informal coordination mechanisms that can shape outcomes long after graduation. When Jesuit alumni encounter each other in professional settings, they don't need formal instructions to coordinate their approaches. They already share common assumptions about how complex problems should be analyzed, how competing values should be balanced, and how decisions should be made. This creates a form of distributed influence that's incredibly difficult to track or counter. There's no central command structure issuing orders, no formal coordination mechanism, no paper trail to follow. Yet, outcomes consistently reflect certain patterns of thinking and certain approaches to problem solving that can be traced back to shared educational experiences and common moral frameworks. The current Superior General understands this dynamic clearly. His influence doesn't operate primarily through direct commands or formal authority. It flows through the educational institutions, research centers, and networks of relationships that shape how challenges are understood and addressed across multiple sectors and countries. This represents a fundamentally different model of power than what we're accustomed to analyzing. Traditional power operates through hierarchies, commands, and control. But the influence we're examining here operates through networks, relationships, and shared frameworks of understanding. It's more subtle, more distributed, and in many ways more resilient than traditional forms of power. But it also raises more complex questions about accountability and democratic oversight. When influence operates through informal networks, rather than formal institutions, when power flows through relationships rather than official hierarchies, when the most important decisions emerge from conversations rather than votes, how do we ensure that diverse voices are heard and democratic values are preserved? These questions become even more urgent when we consider the scope of the challenges humanity faces in the coming decades. Climate change, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, space exploration, global inequality, these issues will require forms of coordination and decision-making that transcend traditional boundaries between nations, sectors, and institutions. The organizations and networks that can facilitate this coordination will wield enormous influence over humanity's future. Whether this influence serves broad public interests or narrow organizational goals will depend on how successfully we develop mechanisms for accountability, transparency, and democratic participation that can operate effectively in our networked, interconnected world. The man in black who sits quietly in Rome, connected to this vast global network of education, research, and humanitarian service, represents both the promise and the challenge of 21st century governance. His influence operates through mechanisms that can address global challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but also in ways that circumvent traditional democratic controls. Understanding how this influence works, how it shapes outcomes, and how it might be made more accountable to broader public interests may be one of the most important tasks facing anyone who cares about the future of democratic governance in our interconnected world. The story of the Black Pope isn't just about one man or one organization. It's about the evolution of power itself in an age when the most important challenges require coordination across all the traditional boundaries that have organized human societies for centuries. As this influence continues to evolve and expand, the questions it raises about power, accountability, and democratic participation will only become more pressing. The answers we develop will shape not just how we understand the role of the Jesuits in global affairs, but how we navigate the fundamental challenge of governing our shared future in a world where the most powerful influences are often the ones we can't see coming. The web of influence extends even deeper when we examine how this network has mastered perhaps the most sophisticated form of power, the ability to shape reality itself through the control of narrative and meaning. While armies conquer territory and corporations accumulate wealth, the truly transformative power lies in determining how people understand their world, their purpose, and their possibilities. Consider this carefully. Every morning, millions of people wake up and make decisions based on frameworks of understanding they absorbed during their education. They choose careers based on concepts of service and leadership they learned in university. They vote for policies that align with moral principles they developed in their formative years. They raise children according to values they internalized decades earlier. The individual who shaped those frameworks, who planted those concepts, who nurtured those values, that person influences countless decisions without ever knowing the people making them. This is exactly the kind of influence the Jesuit network has been cultivating for nearly 5 centuries. It's not about commanding obedience or demanding loyalty. It's about creating the intellectual and moral architecture within which future generations will think, choose, and act. The sophistication of this approach becomes visible when you examine how Jesuit institutions have positioned themselves at the intersection of knowledge creation and cultural formation. They don't just run schools. They operate research universities that generate new knowledge about everything from neuroscience to international relations. They don't just teach students. They train future professors who will shape how subjects are taught at institutions around the world. They don't just publish books. They influence entire academic disciplines through the scholars they educate and the research they fund. Take the field of business ethics, for example. When corporations began facing pressure to consider their social and environmental impact, where did they turn for guidance? Often to frameworks developed at Jesuit business schools that had been thinking about the relationship between profit and purpose for decades. When governments needed to develop policies for corporate responsibility, they frequently consulted experts whose thinking had been shaped by Jesuit approaches to moral reasoning in economic contexts. The result is that certain ways of thinking about business, emphasizing stakeholder value over shareholder value, considering long-term sustainability over short-term profits, balancing competitive success with social responsibility, have become mainstream not through political mandate or regulatory requirement, but through the gradual influence of educational institutions that embedded these concepts in the minds of future business leaders. This same pattern appears across virtually every field of human endeavor. In international relations, concepts of humanitarian intervention, responsibility to protect, and just war theory that guide policy discussions often trace their intellectual lineage to scholars and institutions with Jesuit connections. In healthcare, approaches to medical ethics that emphasize human dignity and social justice reflect moral frameworks developed through centuries of Jesuit engagement with questions of healing and care. In environmental policy, ideas about stewardship, sustainability, and intergenerational responsibility draw heavily on intellectual traditions that Jesuit institutions have helped preserve and develop. The cumulative effect is that what we might think of as secular, rational policy debates are often structured by moral and intellectual frameworks that have deep religious and philosophical roots. This doesn't make the policies wrong or inappropriate. Many of them address genuine needs and reflect widely shared values. But it does mean that the range of options that receive serious consideration is subtly but systematically shaped by particular worldviews and assumptions. The power to set the agenda, to determine which questions get asked, and which approaches seem reasonable, often proves more consequential than the power to dictate specific answers. And this agenda-setting power operates most effectively when it's invisible, when it feels natural and inevitable, rather than imposed or manipulative. This is where the current structure of global influence becomes particularly intriguing. In previous eras, powerful institutions, whether religious, political, or economic, operated through clearly visible hierarchies and explicit authority relationships. Kings issued decrees, generals commanded armies, popes issued encyclicals. The sources of power and the mechanisms of influence were relatively transparent, even if the decision-making processes weren't always democratic. But in our current era, the most consequential forms of influence often operate through networks rather than hierarchies, through relationships rather than commands, through shared frameworks rather than explicit directives. This makes them simultaneously more flexible and more difficult to understand or challenge. The Superior General doesn't need to issue orders to shape global policy debates. He can influence the priorities of Jesuit research institutions, which produce scholarship that informs policy discussions. He can guide the curriculum development at Jesuit universities, which shapes how future leaders learn to think about complex challenges. He can facilitate connections between Jesuit alumni in different sectors and countries, creating informal networks that can coordinate responses to emerging issues. None of these activities violates any laws or norms. Educational institutions are supposed to conduct research and shape how students think. Alumni networks naturally facilitate professional connections and collaboration. Research findings appropriately influence policy discussions. But the aggregate effect is a form of coordinated influence that can shape outcomes across multiple sectors and countries, without any formal command structure or explicit coordination mechanism. This distributed approach to influence has several significant advantages over traditional forms of power. It's more resilient because it doesn't depend on any single institution or individual. It's more adaptable because it can respond to changing circumstances through multiple channels simultaneously. It's more legitimate because it operates through activities, education, research, humanitarian service that are widely respected and valued. But it also raises profound questions about accountability and democratic governance. When influence operates through informal networks rather than formal institutions, how do we ensure that it serves broad public interests rather than narrow organizational goals? When power flows through relationships rather than official hierarchies, how do we maintain transparency and oversight? When the most important decisions emerge from conversations between people who share common educational backgrounds rather than from democratic deliberation, How do we ensure that diverse voices and perspectives are represented? These questions become particularly urgent when we consider the scope of the challenges that this network is positioning itself to address. Climate change, artificial intelligence, global inequality, technological governance, international security. These are issues that will shape the future of human civilization. The frameworks we use to understand these challenges, the approaches we take to address them, and the values that guide our responses will have consequences that extend far beyond any single generation or geographical region. If a single network, no matter how well-intentioned or historically significant, has disproportionate influence over how these challenges are understood and addressed, it raises fundamental questions about representation, diversity, and democratic participation in global governance. Even if the network's perspectives align with widely shared values, the concentration of influence in any single set of institutions and relationships creates risks that go to the heart of how power should be distributed in democratic societies. The challenge becomes even more complex when we consider how this network intersects with other forms of concentrated power in our contemporary world. The relationships between Jesuit institutions and major technology companies, between Jesuit alumni and government agencies, between Jesuit research centers and international organizations, create webs of influence that are incredibly difficult to map, understand, or regulate. When the same individuals move between different sectors throughout their careers, from Jesuit universities to government positions to corporate boards to international organizations, they carry with them not just their individual expertise and relationships, but shared frameworks for understanding how the world works and how decisions should be made. These shared frameworks can create informal coordination mechanisms that operate across traditional boundaries between public and private, domestic and international, religious and secular. The result is a form of meta-governance that shapes how governance itself operates. Rather than seeking direct control over specific policies or decisions, this network influences the processes through which policies are developed and decisions are made. It shapes who gets invited to participate in important conversations, which expertise is considered relevant and credible, what values are treated as legitimate guides for decision-making, and what outcomes are considered acceptable or desirable. This meta-approach to power explains why the network has remained influential across so many different historical periods and political systems. Rather than depending on any particular configuration of power, it focuses on maintaining relevance to whatever configurations emerge. Rather than aligning with specific ideologies or interests, it positions itself to offer value to diverse stakeholders, regardless of their particular perspectives. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, embodies this sophisticated approach to influence. His background combines theological training with advanced study in political science. His career has included academic positions, administrative roles, and international experience. His approach to leadership reflects not just traditional religious authority, but deep understanding of how influence operates in complex, networked systems. He doesn't need to issue public statements or appear on television to shape global affairs. His influence operates through the institutions he guides, the networks he facilitates, and the frameworks he helps develop. When Jesuit universities adjust their research priorities, when Jesuit-educated leaders encounter each other in professional settings, when Jesuit approaches to moral reasoning are applied to contemporary challenges, his influence ripples through systems in ways that are largely invisible to public scrutiny. This invisibility isn't accidental, it's strategic. Visible power invites resistance, opposition, and regulation. Invisible power operates below the threshold of awareness, shaping outcomes without triggering defensive responses. It's the difference between commanding obedience and inspiring voluntary alignment, between forcing compliance and creating genuine commitment. But invisibility also creates accountability problems. Democratic systems depend on the ability of citizens to understand how power operates, who exercises influence, and how decisions are made. When the most consequential forms of influence operate through mechanisms that are difficult to detect or analyze, it becomes nearly impossible for democratic oversight to function effectively. This creates a fundamental tension between effectiveness and accountability. The very features that make networked influence so powerful, its flexibility, its resilience, its ability to operate across traditional boundaries, also make it difficult to subject to democratic control. The question facing contemporary societies is whether we can develop new forms of accountability and oversight that can operate effectively in our networked, interconnected world without destroying the beneficial aspects of these influence networks. The stakes of this question are enormous. The challenges facing humanity in the coming decades, from climate change to artificial intelligence to global inequality, require forms of coordination and decision-making that transcend traditional boundaries between nations, sectors, and institutions. Networks like the one we've been examining may be essential for addressing these challenges effectively. But if these networks operate outside democratic oversight, if their influence shapes outcomes without public awareness or participation, if their priorities and perspectives become dominant without competitive challenge from alternative viewpoints, then we risk creating forms of governance that are effective but not legitimate, powerful but not accountable. The man in black who sits quietly in Rome represents both the promise and the peril of this new form of power. His network may be capable of addressing global challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but it also operates in ways that circumvent traditional democratic controls. Understanding how to harness its capabilities while ensuring its accountability may be one of the most important governance challenges of our time. The story continues to unfold in ways that are largely invisible to public view, through conversations between individuals who share common educational backgrounds, through research collaborations that span continents, through informal networks that connect alumni across different sectors and countries. Each of these interactions contributes to the gradual evolution of how we understand and respond to the challenges facing our interconnected world. Whether this evolution serves broad public interests or narrow organizational goals depends on questions that we're still learning how to ask, much less answer. But as the influence of networked power continues to grow, these questions will only become more urgent. The future of democratic governance in our interconnected world may depend on our ability to understand and address them effectively. The shadow cast by this network grows longer as we examine how it has learned to navigate the most complex challenge of all, maintaining influence across generations while adapting to rapidly changing global circumstances. This isn't just about preserving an organization or maintaining traditions. It's about ensuring that particular approaches to understanding and addressing human challenges remain relevant and influential regardless of how the world changes around them. Think about the extraordinary nature of this challenge. The Jesuit network was founded during the Protestant Reformation, survived the scientific revolution, adapted to the age of exploration, navigated the Industrial Revolution, endured 2 world wars, participated in decolonization, and now operates in an era of digital transformation and global connectivity. Each of these transitions could have rendered their approach obsolete or irrelevant. Instead, they've managed to remain not just present, but influential through every major transformation of the modern world. This adaptability isn't the result of luck or accident. It reflects sophisticated strategic thinking about how to maintain relevance across changing circumstances. Rather than defending specific positions or particular institutional arrangements, the network has focused on cultivating capabilities that remain valuable regardless of how the external environment evolves. The most important of these capabilities is the ability to develop and deploy intellectual frameworks that can make sense of complex changing situations. While other organizations struggle to understand new challenges or adapt their approaches to unfamiliar circumstances, the Jesuit network can draw on centuries of experience in analyzing complex moral and practical problems, developing nuanced responses to competing demands, and maintaining effectiveness across diverse cultural and political environments. This intellectual flexibility becomes particularly valuable during periods of rapid change and uncertainty. When established institutions struggle to understand emerging challenges, when traditional approaches prove inadequate, when familiar categories no longer capture the complexity of new situations, organizations that can provide fresh perspectives and novel frameworks become incredibly influential. The current global transition to a more connected, technologically mediated, environmentally constrained world represents exactly this kind of transformative challenge. Traditional institutions, whether governmental, corporate, or international, often find themselves struggling to understand and respond effectively to issues that transcend their established domains of expertise and authority. In this environment, the Jesuit network's combination of moral reasoning, global perspective, and adaptive capacity positions it to play increasingly important roles in shaping how humanity responds to unprecedented challenges. Their influence operates not through formal authority but through the frameworks they provide for understanding complex situations and the relationships they facilitate between diverse stakeholders. Consider how this plays out in contemporary policy debates. When world leaders gather to discuss climate change, the conversations don't just involve technical discussions about emission levels and renewable energy technologies. They also involve fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and the proper relationship between present welfare and future obligations. These are exactly the kinds of moral and philosophical questions that Jesuit institutions have been exploring for centuries. When technology companies grapple with the ethical implications of artificial intelligence, they're not just dealing with engineering challenges, they're confronting fundamental questions about human agency, the nature of intelligence, the proper relationship between humans and machines, and the distribution of power in society. Again, these are questions that connect directly to intellectual traditions that Jesuit institutions have helped develop and preserve. When governments attempt to address global inequality, they're not just dealing with economic policy. They're wrestling with questions about human dignity, social solidarity, the proper role of institutions, and the balance between individual liberty and collective responsibility. These moral and political questions have been central to Jesuit thinking since the order's founding. The result is that Jesuit perspectives become relevant to virtually every major challenge facing contemporary societies, not because of any conspiracy or deliberate coordination, but because the intellectual traditions they represent address fundamental questions that arise in any serious attempt to understand and respond to complex human challenges. This relevance translates into influence through multiple channels. Jesuit-educated individuals bring particular frameworks for moral reasoning into their professional activities. Jesuit institutions provide forums for dialogue between diverse stakeholders who might not otherwise find opportunities to engage with each other. Jesuit research centers produce scholarship that informs policy debates and academic discussions. Jesuit networks facilitate relationships that can enable coordination and cooperation across traditional boundaries. The aggregate effect is that Jesuit approaches to understanding and addressing complex challenges become embedded in the infrastructure of global governance, not through any formal mandate or explicit agreement, but through the gradual accumulation of relationships, frameworks, and practices that prove useful for addressing difficult problems. This embedded influence operates across multiple timescales simultaneously. In the term, Jesuit-educated individuals apply their training to immediate challenges in their professional roles. In the medium term, Jesuit institutions shape how emerging leaders learn to think about complex problems. In the long term, Jesuit intellectual traditions influence how entire fields of knowledge and practice evolve over time. The current Superior General operates at the center of all these timescales simultaneously. His decisions about immediate priorities influence how Jesuit resources are deployed to address current challenges. His guidance of institutional development shapes how future leaders will be educated. His positioning of the network in relation to emerging trends influences how Jesuit intellectual traditions will evolve to remain relevant for future generations. This multi-temporal approach to influence represents a form of strategic thinking that extends far beyond the horizons that constrain most other forms of organized power. While political leaders focus on electoral cycles, corporate executives concentrate on quarterly earnings, and even international organizations operate within relatively short planning horizons. The Jesuit network can maintain strategic perspectives that span decades and centuries. This long-term perspective provides significant advantages in addressing challenges that unfold over extended time periods. Climate change, technological transformation, demographic transitions, cultural evolution. These are all processes that require sustained attention and coordinated responses over time frames that exceed the operational horizons of most institutions. The ability to maintain focus and coordination across these extended time frames gives the Jesuit network unique capabilities for addressing some of the most important challenges facing humanity. But it also raises questions about democratic accountability and representation that become more complex as the temporal scope of influence extends. When decisions made today will influence outcomes for decades or centuries, when the people who will be most affected by those outcomes haven't yet been born, when the institutions that exist today may not survive to oversee the implementation of current choices, how do we ensure that decision-making processes reflect appropriate values and priorities? These questions become particularly acute when we consider how the network's long-term perspective intersects with its global reach and institutional influence. The combination of extended temporal horizons, broad geographical scope, and deep institutional penetration creates a form of power that operates across scales and timeframes that exceed the capacity of traditional democratic oversight mechanisms. The challenge is compounded by the fact that this influence often operates through mechanisms that are individually benign and collectively beneficial. Educational activities, humanitarian services, research programs, cultural exchanges. These are all activities that most people would consider valuable and appropriate. But when they're coordinated across global networks over extended time periods with strategic intent, they create cumulative effects that may not be visible until they've become deeply embedded in social and institutional structures. This creates a fundamental tension between the long-term strategic thinking that's necessary for addressing complex global challenges and the shorter-term accountability mechanisms that democratic systems rely on for legitimacy and oversight. The very features that make the Jesuit network effective for addressing multi-generational challenges also make it difficult to subject to democratic control. Resolving this tension may require developing new forms of democratic participation and oversight that can operate effectively across the extended temporal and geographical scales on which contemporary challenges unfold. This is itself a complex institutional and political challenge that goes far beyond any single organization or network. But understanding how the Jesuit network operates across these multiple scales and timeframes provides important insights into both the possibilities and the perils of networked power in our interconnected world. Their approach demonstrates that it's possible to maintain strategic coordination across boundaries of time, space, and institutional affiliation that traditionally limit the scope of organized influence. Whether this capability serves broad public interests or narrow organizational goals depends on questions of values, priorities, and accountability that extend far beyond the specific case we've been examining. But as humanity grapples with challenges that transcend traditional boundaries and timeframes, understanding how to harness these capabilities while ensuring their democratic accountability may be essential for our collective future. The man in black who sits at the center of this network embodies both the promise and the complexity of 21st century governance. His influence operates through mechanisms that can address global challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but also in ways that challenge traditional notions of democratic accountability and representation. As we move deeper into an era defined by global connectivity, technological transformation, and planetary scale challenges, the questions raised by this form of networked power will only become more pressing. How we answer them may determine not just the future role of the Jesuits in global affairs, but the broader question of how power, accountability, and democratic participation can be balanced in our interconnected world. The shadows continue to lengthen, the networks continue to evolve, and the influence continues to flow through channels that remain largely invisible to public view. Understanding these hidden currents of power may be essential for anyone who hopes to navigate the complex challenges of governing our shared future in an age when the most important influences are often the ones we never see coming. The architecture of this influence reveals itself most clearly when we examine how it operates in the spaces between formal institutions, in the grey zones where official authority ends and informal coordination begins. These are the realms where the most consequential decisions often get made, where competing interests get reconciled, where seemingly impossible compromises get negotiated into existence. Picture a scenario that plays out regularly in capitals around the world. A major international crisis erupts, threatening to destabilize entire regions. Official diplomatic channels become clogged with protocol and posturing. Traditional mediation mechanisms prove inadequate to bridge the gaps between opposing sides. Yet somehow, quietly, behind the scenes, conversations begin happening that weren't supposed to be possible. The participants in these conversations don't appear on any organizational chart. They hold no official diplomatic credentials. They represent no government or corporation directly. Yet they possess something that proves more valuable than any formal authority: the trust of multiple parties, the credibility to speak across traditional boundaries, and the moral authority to address fundamental questions about justice, responsibility, and human dignity. This is where the Jesuit network reveals its most sophisticated capabilities. Not in commanding obedience or demanding compliance, but in creating spaces where impossible conversations become possible, where irreconcilable differences can be explored without losing face, where solutions can emerge that none of the official participants could have proposed directly. The mechanics of this process are fascinating to observe. A Jesuit-educated diplomat mentions a particular framework for thinking about territorial disputes during a casual conversation at an academic conference. A researcher at a Jesuit institution publishes a paper that reframes a contentious issue in ways that open new possibilities for compromise. A Jesuit priest working in a conflict zone facilitates informal meetings between community leaders who couldn't meet through any official channel. None of these activities constitutes formal mediation or official negotiation. Yet collectively, they create conditions that make formal agreements possible. They shift the terms of debate, introduce new options for consideration, and build relationships that can support implementation of eventual accords. This behind-the-scenes influence operates through what intelligence professionals call track 2 diplomacy, unofficial channels that complement and sometimes substitute for formal diplomatic processes. But the Jesuit version of track 2 diplomacy has several distinctive features that make it particularly effective. First, it operates through institutions and individuals that are widely perceived as legitimate and trustworthy across different political and cultural contexts. A Jesuit university can host sensitive conversations that would be impossible at government facilities. A humanitarian mission can bring together antagonists who couldn't meet in any official setting. An academic conference can provide cover for discussions that would be too politically sensitive to conduct openly. Second, it draws on intellectual traditions that provide frameworks for addressing fundamental moral and political questions that often underlie surface conflicts. Disputes that appear to be about territory, resources, or political control frequently involve deeper questions about identity, justice, and historical grievance. Jesuit intellectual traditions offer sophisticated approaches to these deeper questions that can help parties move beyond zero-sum thinking toward mutually acceptable solutions. Third, it operates through networks of relationships that extend across traditional boundaries between nations, sectors, and institutions. When official diplomatic relationships break down, these informal networks can maintain communication channels that prevent complete isolation and create opportunities for eventual reconciliation. The cumulative effect is a form of diplomatic infrastructure that operates parallel to, but independently, of official government channels. This infrastructure doesn't replace formal diplomacy, but it provides crucial support functions that make formal diplomacy more likely to succeed when conditions are right. The current Superior General understands this diplomatic dimension of Jesuit influence clearly. His approach to international engagement reflects not just religious concerns, but sophisticated understanding of how conflicts develop, how they can be addressed, and how long-term stability can be maintained. He doesn't need to issue public statements about international crises to influence their resolution. His network can work quietly behind the scenes to create conditions that make peaceful solutions more likely. This diplomatic capability becomes particularly valuable during periods of international tension and uncertainty, when official channels become frozen by political considerations, when public positions become too hardened to allow for compromise, when domestic political pressures prevent leaders from taking necessary but unpopular steps toward reconciliation. Informal networks can maintain momentum toward eventual resolution. But this capability also raises important questions about democratic accountability and representation in international affairs. When crucial diplomatic work happens through informal channels, when key decisions emerge from conversations that occur outside official oversight, when the success or failure of conflict resolution depends partly on networks that operate beyond democratic control, what does that mean for the sovereignty of democratic institutions? These questions become particularly complex when we consider how this diplomatic influence intersects with other forms of power in our interconnected world. The relationships between Jesuit institutions and major corporations, between Jesuit alumni and government agencies, between Jesuit research centers and international organizations, create multiple channels through which informal diplomatic influence can flow. When a Jesuit-educated business leader has informal conversations with government officials about trade policies that might affect conflict resolution, when a researcher at a Jesuit institution provides analysis that influences humanitarian interventions, when alumni networks facilitate communications between parties that couldn't communicate through official channels, the boundaries between religious, commercial, and governmental influence become increasingly blurred. This blurring of boundaries reflects broader changes in how international affairs actually operate in our interconnected world. Traditional models of international relations assume that governments are the primary actors, that their interactions occur through formal diplomatic channels, and that domestic and international affairs can be clearly separated. But contemporary reality involves multiple actors: corporations, NGOs, academic institutions, religious organizations, informal networks, operating across boundaries that were once clearly defined. In this more complex environment, the Jesuit network's ability to operate across traditional boundaries becomes a significant strategic advantage. They can facilitate communications between actors who couldn't interact through any single formal channel. They can provide forums for dialogue that transcend traditional institutional limitations. They can offer perspectives that bridge different sectors and levels of analysis. But this advantage also creates responsibilities that extend beyond traditional religious or educational missions. When your network can influence international conflicts, when your perspectives shape humanitarian interventions, when your relationships affect the success or failure of peace processes, you're operating in domains where the stakes extend far beyond any single organization or community. The current Superior General faces this expanded scope of responsibility directly. His decisions about where to deploy Jesuit resources, which conflicts to engage with, How to position the network in relation to major international challenges can have consequences that affect millions of people who have no voice in his selection, no influence over his priorities, and no mechanism for holding him accountable for his choices. This creates a fundamental tension between the effectiveness that comes from being able to operate outside traditional constraints and the legitimacy that comes from being subject to democratic oversight and accountability. The very features that make the network effective for addressing complex international challenges also make it difficult to subject to the kinds of controls that democratic societies typically require for exercises of significant power. Resolving this tension requires thinking creatively about how accountability mechanisms can be adapted to operate effectively in our networked, interconnected world. Traditional approaches to democratic oversight assume clear boundaries between institutions, direct relationships between representatives and constituents, and transparent processes for making and implementing decisions. But networked power operates across boundaries, through relationships rather than formal hierarchies, and through processes that are often invisible to public scrutiny. The challenge is complicated by the fact that the most important international challenges, climate change, pandemic response, technological governance, economic inequality, require exactly the kind of cross-boundary coordination that traditional accountability mechanisms struggle to address. We need forms of governance that can operate across traditional limitations while remaining subject to democratic control. The Jesuit network, with its centuries of experience in cross-boundary coordination and its sophisticated approaches to moral reasoning, may offer important insights into how such governance systems might work, but whether their approach can be adapted to serve broader democratic purposes depends on questions about transparency, participation, and accountability that extend far beyond their specific case. These questions become more urgent as the scope of international challenges continues to expand and the limitations of traditional institutional responses become more apparent. The network we've been examining demonstrates that it's possible to maintain effective coordination across boundaries that typically limit institutional capabilities. But it also demonstrates how such coordination can operate outside traditional democratic controls. Understanding how to harness the benefits of networked governance while ensuring its democratic accountability may be one of the most important challenges facing contemporary societies. The man in black who sits at the center of the Jesuit network embodies both the promise and the peril of this challenge. His influence operates through mechanisms that can address international challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but also in ways that circumvent traditional democratic oversight. As international challenges become more complex and interconnected, as traditional institutions struggle to keep pace with rapidly changing circumstances, as the need for innovative approaches to governance becomes more pressing, the questions raised by networked power will only become more important. How we answer them may determine not just the future role of religious organizations in international affairs, but the broader question of how democratic governance can adapt to remain effective and legitimate in our interconnected world. The influence continues to flow through channels that span continents and centuries, through relationships that transcend traditional boundaries, through conversations that occur in spaces between formal institutions. Understanding these hidden currents of power may be essential for anyone who hopes to navigate the complex challenges of governing our shared future in an age when the most important decisions often emerge from networks we never see and conversations we're never told about. The threads of this hidden governance system extend into territories that few would expect, weaving through the fabric of modern life in ways that touch virtually every aspect of how our world operates. From the algorithms that determine what information we see online to the policies that shape global trade, from the frameworks that guide medical research to the principles that govern international law, the fingerprints of this network appear in places where most people would never think to look. Consider the realm of technology governance, one of the most pressing challenges of our time. As artificial intelligence reshapes industries, as social media platforms influence democratic processes, as biotechnology opens unprecedented possibilities for human enhancement. The questions we face aren't just technical. They're fundamentally about values, priorities, and the kind of future we want to create. When tech companies establish ethics boards to guide their development of artificial intelligence, where do they find the expertise to address questions about consciousness, free will, and human dignity? When governments attempt to regulate emerging technologies, what frameworks do they use to balance innovation with safety, progress with precaution, economic growth with social stability? When international organizations seek to coordinate responses to technological challenges that transcend national boundaries, what principles guide their approach? The answers to these questions increasingly trace back to institutions and individuals connected to the Jesuit network. Not because of any conspiracy or coordination, but because these institutions have spent centuries developing sophisticated approaches to exactly these kinds of moral and practical challenges. Their combination of intellectual rigor, moral reasoning, and global perspective makes them natural participants in discussions about how humanity should respond to unprecedented technological capabilities. But their participation isn't neutral. The frameworks they bring to these discussions reflect particular assumptions about human nature, social organization, and moral reasoning that shape the conclusions they reach. When these frameworks become embedded in the governance structures for emerging technologies, they influence how those technologies are developed and deployed in ways that affect billions of people who have no voice in the process. This dynamic extends beyond technology into virtually every domain of contemporary governance. In global health policy, Jesuit medical schools and research institutions have pioneered approaches to healthcare delivery that emphasize human dignity, social justice, and community participation. These approaches have influenced how international health organizations design programs, how governments structure healthcare systems, and how medical professionals understand their responsibilities to patients and communities. In environmental policy, Jesuit institutions have developed theological and philosophical frameworks for understanding humanity's relationship with the natural world that emphasize stewardship, sustainability, and intergenerational responsibility. These frameworks have influenced how climate policies are designed, how environmental regulations are structured, and how corporate sustainability programs are developed. In economic policy, Jesuit business schools and research centers have pioneered approaches to thinking about corporate responsibility, stakeholder capitalism, and sustainable development that have reshaped how business leaders understand their roles and responsibilities. These approaches have influenced everything from corporate governance structures to international trade agreements to development assistance programs. The pattern is consistent across domains. Jesuit institutions develop sophisticated approaches to complex challenges, educate future leaders who carry these approaches into positions of influence, and create networks that facilitate the spread of these approaches across institutional boundaries. The result is that particular ways of thinking about fundamental questions become embedded in the infrastructure of global governance without any explicit mandate or democratic authorization. This embedded influence operates through what scholars call epistemic communities, networks of experts who share common approaches to understanding and addressing complex problems. These communities shape policy not through formal authority, but through their ability to define problems, identify solutions, and establish criteria for evaluating different options. The Jesuit network has been particularly effective at creating and sustaining epistemic communities that span traditional boundaries between academic disciplines, professional sectors, and national jurisdictions. Their educational institutions bring together students from diverse backgrounds to study under faculty who share common intellectual and moral frameworks. Their research centers facilitate collaboration between scholars working on related problems in different fields. Their alumni networks maintain relationships that enable ongoing coordination and mutual influence throughout their careers. The result is a form of intellectual influence that operates across generations and institutions. The frameworks developed in Jesuit classrooms today will shape how tomorrow's leaders understand and respond to challenges that may not even be visible yet. The research conducted at Jesuit institutions will inform policy debates for decades to come. The networks of relationships formed through Jesuit educational experiences will create coordination mechanisms that can influence outcomes long after graduation. This long-term, cross-institutional approach to influence represents a fundamentally different model of power than traditional approaches based on formal authority or resource control. It's more subtle, more distributed, and in many ways more resilient than conventional forms of power. But it also operates largely outside traditional mechanisms for democratic accountability and oversight. The current Superior General operates at the center of this vast epistemic network. His influence flows not through direct commands, but through his ability to shape the priorities and approaches of institutions that educate future leaders, conduct research that informs policy debates, and facilitate relationships that enable coordination across traditional boundaries. When he guides the development of curricula at Jesuit universities, he's influencing how thousands of students learn to think about complex challenges. When he sets research priorities for Jesuit institutions, he's shaping the questions that scholars investigate and the frameworks they use to understand their findings. When he facilitates connections between Jesuit alumni in different sectors and countries, he's creating networks that can coordinate responses to emerging challenges. This meta-level influence operates across multiple domains simultaneously. The same frameworks that guide thinking about artificial intelligence governance also influence approaches to climate policy. The same networks that coordinate responses to humanitarian crises also facilitate collaboration on economic development programs. The same principles that shape medical ethics also guide thinking about business responsibility. The interconnected nature of this influence makes it both more powerful and more difficult to understand or challenge than traditional forms of institutional power. When influence operates through isolated institutions or single-issue networks, it's relatively easy to identify and assess. But when it operates through integrated systems that span multiple domains and levels of analysis, it becomes much more difficult to trace its effects or evaluate its implications. This systemic integration also makes the network more resilient to external challenges. Traditional institutions can be weakened by attacking their resource base, challenging their formal authority, or mobilizing opposition to their specific policies. But networked influence can adapt to such challenges by shifting resources between institutions, operating through informal rather than formal channels, and reframing issues in ways that reduce opposition. The ability to operate across multiple domains and levels of analysis also provides the network with unique capabilities for addressing complex, interconnected challenges. Climate change affects everything from agricultural productivity to international security to technological development. Addressing it effectively requires coordination across all these domains. Similarly, technological governance involves questions of economics, ethics, law, and international relations that can't be addressed effectively through any single institutional channel. In this environment, organizations that can maintain coherent approaches across multiple domains and facilitate coordination between different types of expertise have significant advantages over more specialized institutions. The Jesuit network's combination of intellectual breadth, moral coherence, and institutional diversity positions it to play increasingly important roles in addressing the complex, interconnected challenges that define our contemporary moment. But this capability also raises fundamental questions about the concentration of influence in contemporary governance systems. When a single network can shape thinking across multiple domains, when its approaches become embedded in the infrastructure of global governance, when its priorities influence resource allocation and policy development across diverse institutions, What does that mean for pluralism, competition, and democratic choice in how societies address their challenges? These questions become particularly pressing when we consider the scope of the challenges that this network is positioning itself to address. The frameworks being developed today for governing artificial intelligence will influence how these technologies develop for decades to come. The approaches being established for addressing climate change will shape humanity's response to its greatest environmental challenge. The principles being embedded in international law and governance structures will influence how global affairs are conducted for generations. If these frameworks, approaches, and principles reflect the perspectives and priorities of a single network, even one with admirable intentions and impressive capabilities, it represents a form of concentrated influence that may be incompatible with democratic values and pluralistic governance. The challenge is figuring out how to harness the benefits of networked coordination while ensuring that diverse voices and perspectives can compete effectively in shaping how societies respond to their greatest challenges. The man in black who sits at the center of this network embodies both the promise and the danger of 21st century governance. His influence operates through mechanisms that can address complex, interconnected challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but also in ways that concentrate power in networks that operate largely outside democratic oversight and accountability. Understanding how this influence works, how it shapes outcomes, and how it might be made more accountable to broader public interests represents one of the most important governance challenges of our time. The answers we develop will influence not just how we understand the role of religious organizations in contemporary affairs, but how we address the fundamental question of how power should be distributed and controlled in our interconnected, rapidly changing world. The networks continue to evolve, the influence continues to flow, and the questions continue to multiply. In conference rooms and classrooms, in research laboratories and humanitarian missions, in quiet conversations between individuals who share common educational backgrounds and moral frameworks, the future of global governance is being shaped in ways that remain largely invisible to public scrutiny. Whether this hidden governance serves broad public interests or narrow institutional goals may depend on our ability to understand and address questions we're still learning how to ask. The weaving of this influence becomes even more intricate when we examine how it operates in the realm of global education, where the shaping of young minds creates ripple effects that extend far beyond any single classroom or campus. Education, after all, is the ultimate long-term investment in influence. Plant an idea in a 17-year-old's mind, and it might shape decisions they make 40 years later when they're sitting in a corporate boardroom or government cabinet. The scope of this educational network is staggering when you step back and look at the full picture. We're not just talking about a handful of elite universities in major capitals. This is a web that extends into over 100 countries, reaching from prestigious research institutions in Washington and London to rural schools in the mountains of Bolivia, from urban colleges in Manila to missionary schools in remote African villages. But here's what makes this network particularly sophisticated. It doesn't operate like a traditional educational franchise where every school teaches the same curriculum. Instead, it functions more like a distributed intelligence system, where each institution adapts to its local environment while maintaining connection to a shared intellectual and moral framework. A Jesuit high school in Detroit might focus on urban social justice issues, while a Jesuit university in Tokyo emphasizes technology ethics and cultural dialogue. A college in São Paulo might specialize in environmental sustainability, while an institution in Nairobi concentrates on development economics and conflict resolution. Each responds to its immediate context, yet all share common approaches to critical thinking, moral reasoning, and global awareness. This distributed approach creates something remarkable: a global network of educational institutions that can respond to local needs while maintaining coherent influence on global issues. When climate change becomes a pressing concern, Every institution in the O network can address it from their particular perspective, while contributing to a coordinated global response. When artificial intelligence raises ethical questions, schools around the world can explore different dimensions of the challenge while sharing insights and approaches. The power of this model becomes visible when you trace the career paths of graduates. A student who learns about social responsibility at a Jesuit business school in Barcelona might later work for a multinational corporation, where they encounter a colleague who studied conflict resolution at a Jesuit institution in Lebanon. They don't need to coordinate their approaches explicitly. They already share intellectual frameworks that enable them to work together effectively on complex challenges. This creates a form of soft coordination that operates across industries, countries, and decades. When major corporations need to navigate ethical challenges in emerging markets, when international organizations design humanitarian interventions, when governments attempt to address transnational problems, the decision-making processes often involve multiple individuals who share educational backgrounds that emphasized similar approaches to moral reasoning and global thinking. The current Superior General understands this educational dimension of influence with remarkable clarity. His role extends far beyond managing schools. He's essentially orchestrating a global experiment in consciousness formation, shaping how future leaders learn to perceive and respond to the world around them. When he approves new degree programs that integrate technology with ethics, he's ensuring that tomorrow's engineers and computer scientists will approach their work with moral awareness. When he supports research initiatives that explore the intersection of business and social justice, he's influencing how future corporate leaders will understand their responsibilities. When he facilitates international exchanges that bring together students from different cultures and economic backgrounds, he's creating networks of relationships that will facilitate cooperation on global challenges for decades to come. This educational influence operates through mechanisms that are both subtle and profound. It's not about indoctrination or propaganda. Students at Jesuit institutions engage with diverse perspectives and are encouraged to think critically about complex issues. But the framework within which they learn to think, the questions they're taught to ask, the values they're encouraged to consider, all reflect intellectual traditions that have been refined over centuries. Consider how this plays out in business education. Students at Jesuit business schools don't just learn about maximizing shareholder value. They explore questions about stakeholder responsibility, sustainable development, and the social impact of corporate decisions. They study case studies that highlight ethical dilemmas, engage with frameworks that emphasize long-term thinking, and participate in experiential learning that connects them with communities affected by business decisions. When these students graduate and move into positions of corporate leadership, they don't abandon everything they learned in favor of pure profit maximization. Instead, they bring approaches to business that consider broader social and environmental impacts, that value stakeholder engagement, that think beyond quarterly earnings to long-term sustainability. This doesn't mean they're all saints or that they never make questionable decisions, but it does mean that their decision-making processes are influenced by frameworks that emphasize responsibility, sustainability, and social awareness. When multiplied across thousands of graduates working in corporations around the world, this educational influence can shift how entire industries approach their operations. The same pattern appears in other fields. Students who study international relations at Jesuit institutions learn to think about diplomacy not just as power politics, but as opportunities for dialogue, understanding, and peaceful conflict resolution. Future doctors learn to approach healthcare not just as technical intervention, but as service to human dignity and community well-being. Aspiring lawyers learn to see legal practice not just as advocacy for clients, but as participation in systems of justice that affect entire societies. The cumulative effect is that particular approaches to professional practice become embedded in multiple fields simultaneously. The frameworks that guide thinking about corporate responsibility also influence approaches to medical ethics. The principles that shape diplomatic practice also inform thinking about legal advocacy. The values that guide educational policy also affect approaches to technological development. This cross-disciplinary integration creates a form of cultural influence that operates at the level of professional consciousness. It's not that professionals in different fields coordinate their activities explicitly. Rather, they share underlying assumptions about responsibility, ethics, and social engagement that create natural alignment in how they approach their work. But perhaps most significantly, this educational network serves as a training ground for global leadership in ways that extend far beyond traditional academic preparation. Students don't just learn subjects, they learn to navigate complexity, to work across cultural differences, to balance competing demands, to think strategically about long-term consequences. Many Jesuit institutions deliberately create challenging environments that simulate the kinds of complex leadership situations graduates will face in their careers. Students work on interdisciplinary projects that require them to integrate insights from multiple fields. They participate in international exchanges that force them to adapt to unfamiliar cultural contexts. They engage with real-world problems through service learning and research projects that connect academic study with practical application. This experiential approach to education creates graduates who are not just knowledgeable, but adaptable, not just skilled, but resilient. They're prepared to operate effectively in environments characterized by uncertainty, complexity, and rapid change. Exactly the kinds of environments that define contemporary global leadership. The network effect becomes particularly powerful when you consider how these educational experiences create lasting relationships among future leaders. Students who study together, work on projects together, and navigate challenges together often maintain connections that continue throughout their careers. When they encounter each other years later in professional settings, they already share common experiences and mutual trust that can facilitate cooperation and coordination. These alumni networks create informal channels for communication and collaboration that span industries, countries, and decades. A former student who becomes a government minister might maintain relationships with classmates who went into business, journalism, or humanitarian work. When complex challenges arise that require coordination across sectors, these relationships can provide channels for communication and cooperation that wouldn't exist otherwise. The current Superior General leverages these network effects strategically. By facilitating connections between institutions, supporting exchanges between students and faculty, and creating opportunities for alumni to maintain engagement with their educational communities, he's helping to maintain and strengthen the relationships that enable the network to function effectively. But this networking dimension of educational influence raises important questions about access, equity, and representation in global leadership development. When influential networks are built through educational institutions that require significant resources to attend, when the relationships that facilitate global coordination are formed in exclusive academic environments, when the frameworks that shape global governance emerge from institutions with particular cultural and ideological orientations, what does that mean for diversity and inclusion in global leadership? These questions become particularly pressing when we consider how educational networks intersect with other forms of privilege and power in contemporary societies. Students who can afford to attend prestigious institutions, who have the cultural capital to navigate elite academic environments, who possess the social connections to access opportunities for advanced study, are more likely to develop the relationships and acquire the credentials that open doors to positions of influence. When educational networks that shape global leadership are built through institutions that draw primarily from already privileged populations, they risk creating governance systems that reflect the perspectives and interests of narrow elites rather than the diverse communities they affect. Even when the values and frameworks promoted through these institutions emphasize social justice and global awareness, the process of selection and education may systematically exclude voices and perspectives that could enrich understanding and improve outcomes. The Jesuit network has made significant efforts to address these equity concerns through scholarship programs, partnerships with institutions serving marginalized communities, and commitments to accessibility and inclusion. Many Jesuit institutions have long traditions of serving immigrant communities, first-generation college students, and economically disadvantaged populations. But the fundamental tension remains. Can an educational network that shapes global leadership be both effective and equitable? Can it maintain the coherence and quality that make it influential while also ensuring that it represents the full diversity of human experience and perspective? Can it provide the intensive formation that creates capable leaders while also remaining accessible to individuals from all backgrounds? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're essential to address if educational influence is to serve democratic values and inclusive governance. The concentration of leadership development in any single network, regardless of its intentions or values, creates risks for pluralism and representation that go to the heart of how power should be distributed in democratic societies. The man in black, who guides this vast educational enterprise, understands these tensions clearly. His decisions about institutional priorities, admissions policies, curriculum development, and resource allocation all affect who gets access to the kind of education that prepares individuals for global leadership. His choices about partnerships, exchanges, and network development all influence how diverse perspectives get incorporated into the frameworks that shape future decision-making. The influence continues to flow through lecture halls and libraries, through student organizations and alumni gatherings, through research projects and service learning experiences. Each interaction contributes to the formation of consciousness that will guide decision-making in boardrooms and government offices, in international organizations and humanitarian missions, in research laboratories and media organizations for decades to come. Whether this educational influence serves broad public interests or narrow institutional goals depends on questions about access, representation, and accountability that extend far beyond any single educational network. But understanding how it operates, how it shapes the development of future leaders, and how it might be made more inclusive and democratic may be essential for ensuring that global governance serves the diverse interests of all humanity rather than the particular perspectives of any single educational tradition. The classroom conversations continue, the relationships continue to form, and the frameworks continue to spread through mechanisms that remain largely invisible to public awareness. In this quiet shaping of minds and hearts, in this patient cultivation of leadership capacity, in this careful transmission of values and approaches across generations, we see perhaps the most profound and enduring form of power in our interconnected world. The power to determine not just what future leaders will do, but how they will think about what needs to be done. As we reach the end of our journey into the hidden corridors of power, we find ourselves confronting a truth that's both fascinating and unsettling. The man they call the Black Pope represents something far more complex than a simple religious leader, or even a shadow puppeteer pulling strings from behind Vatican walls. He embodies a new form of power entirely, one that operates through networks rather than hierarchies, through influence rather than commands, through the patient cultivation of minds and relationships, rather than the crude exercise of force or wealth. What we've discovered challenges everything we thought we knew about how power really works in our modern world. While we focus our attention on the obvious centers of authority, presidents and prime ministers, CEOs and celebrities, generals and billionaires, the most consequential decisions affecting our future may be emerging from quiet conversations between individuals who share common educational backgrounds, moral frameworks, and global perspectives developed through centuries of institutional refinement. This isn't the stuff of conspiracy theories or secret societies with hidden agendas. It's something both more subtle and more profound, the systematic cultivation of a particular way of seeing and responding to the world's challenges. when thousands of influential individuals across every sector of society share similar approaches to moral reasoning, strategic thinking, and global awareness. They don't need explicit coordination to create coordinated outcomes. They naturally align around solutions that reflect their shared intellectual and ethical frameworks. The current Superior General, Arturo Sosa, sits at the center of this vast network, not as a commander issuing orders, but as an architect of influence who shapes the conditions within which countless independent decisions get made. His power doesn't flow from his ability to control outcomes directly, but from his capacity to influence the processes through which outcomes emerge. He doesn't tell world leaders what to do. He helps shape how they learn to think about what needs to be done. This represents a fundamental evolution in how influence operates in our interconnected age. Traditional power required visible authority, clear hierarchies, and direct control over resources or territory. But the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century, climate change, technological governance, global inequality, pandemic response, transcend all traditional boundaries and require new forms of coordination that can operate across nations, sectors, and institutions. In this new landscape, the ability to facilitate dialogue between diverse stakeholders, to provide trusted frameworks for addressing complex moral and practical questions, and to maintain networks of relationships that span traditional divisions becomes incredibly valuable. The Jesuit network has spent nearly 5 centuries developing exactly these capabilities, positioning itself to play increasingly important roles in addressing humanity's greatest challenges. But this positioning also creates responsibilities and raises questions that extend far beyond traditional religious or educational missions. When your influence shapes how global challenges are understood and addressed, when your perspectives become embedded in the frameworks that guide international cooperation, when your networks facilitate coordination on issues affecting billions of people, you're operating in domains where the stakes transcend any single organization or community. The fundamental question we must grapple with is whether this form of networked influence enhances or undermines democratic governance. On one hand, the ability to maintain dialogue across hostile boundaries, to provide neutral spaces for difficult conversations, and to offer sophisticated frameworks for complex decisions clearly serves important public purposes. Many conflicts have been resolved, humanitarian crises addressed, and social challenges tackled more effectively because of the capabilities this network provides. On the other hand, when influence operates through informal networks rather than formal institutions, when power flows through relationships rather than accountable hierarchies, when the most important conversations happen between individuals who share common backgrounds rather than through transparent democratic processes, it raises fundamental questions about representation, accountability, and legitimacy in governance. These questions become more pressing as the scope of global challenges continues to expand and the limitations of traditional institutional responses become more apparent. The network we've examined demonstrates that it's possible to maintain effective coordination across boundaries that typically constrain institutional capabilities. But it also demonstrates how such coordination can operate outside traditional democratic controls. The paradox is that the very features that make networked influence so effective, its flexibility, its ability to transcend traditional boundaries, its capacity to operate across extended time horizons, also make it difficult to subject to the kinds of oversight and accountability mechanisms that democratic societies typically require for significant exercises of power. This creates what may be the defining governance challenge of our time: how to harness the benefits of networked coordination while ensuring that it serves broad public interests rather than narrow institutional goals. How do we maintain the capacity for effective global cooperation while preserving democratic values of transparency, participation, and accountability? The answers to these questions will determine not just the future role of religious organizations in global affairs, but the broader evolution of power and governance in our interconnected world. As traditional institutions struggle to address transnational challenges, as new forms of coordination emerge through networks rather than hierarchies, as influence increasingly flows through relationships rather than formal authority, we'll need new approaches to ensuring that power serves democratic purposes. The man in black who sits quietly in Rome, connected to this vast global network of education, research, and humanitarian service, represents both the promise and the challenge of 21st century governance. His influence operates through mechanisms that can address global challenges more effectively than traditional institutions, but also in ways that circumvent traditional democratic oversight. Understanding how this influence works, how it shapes outcomes, and how it might be made more accountable to broader public interests may be essential for navigating the complex challenges of governing our shared future. The story of the Black Pope isn't just about one man or one organization. It's about the fundamental transformation of power itself in an age when the most important challenges require coordination across all the traditional boundaries that have organized human societies for centuries. As we move deeper into this century, as the challenges we face become more complex and interconnected, as the need for innovative approaches to governance becomes more urgent, the questions raised by networked power will only become more important. The influence continues to flow through channels that span continents and centuries, through relationships that transcend traditional boundaries, through conversations that occur in spaces between formal institutions. Whether this hidden governance serves the diverse interests of all humanity or reflects the particular perspectives of narrow networks may depend on our ability to develop new forms of democratic participation and oversight that can operate effectively in our networked, interconnected world. The future of democratic governance itself may hang in the balance. The story we've uncovered tonight forces us to confront an uncomfortable reality about power in our modern world. While we debate the influence of tech billionaires and worry about foreign interference in our elections, we may have overlooked one of the most sophisticated and enduring influence networks operating right under our noses. This isn't about good versus evil, light versus darkness. It's about something far more nuanced and perhaps more consequential. The quiet evolution of how decisions get made, how priorities get set, and how the future gets shaped in our interconnected age. The Black Pope doesn't need to appear on television or issue press releases because his influence operates through channels that most of us never even think to examine. Think about the implications for a moment. When the next global crisis erupts, when humanity faces its next great challenge, when difficult decisions need to be made about technology, environment, or social justice, the frameworks used to understand these challenges and the networks mobilized to address them may all trace back to institutions and individuals connected to this centuries-old system of influence. This raises profound questions that extend far beyond any single organization. In a world where the most important challenges transcend traditional boundaries, where effective governance requires coordination across nations and sectors, where influence increasingly flows through informal networks rather than formal institutions, how do we ensure that diverse voices are heard? How do we maintain democratic accountability when power operates through relationships rather than hierarchies? The man in black sitting quietly in Rome represents more than religious authority or institutional influence. He embodies a new form of power that may define how our interconnected world is governed in the decades to come. Whether this power serves the broad interests of humanity or the narrow perspectives of particular networks depends on questions we're only beginning to learn how to ask. As we've seen throughout this exploration, the most consequential forms of influence in our modern world are often the ones we never see coming. They operate through education rather than coercion, through relationships rather than commands, through the patient cultivation of shared understanding rather than the crude exercise of force. Understanding these hidden currents of power may be essential for anyone who hopes to navigate the complex challenges facing our species. Because in the end, the question isn't whether networks like this exist. They clearly do. The question is whether we can develop the wisdom to ensure they serve the diverse interests of all humanity rather than the particular vision of any single tradition, no matter how noble its intentions. The shadows continue to move across the marble floors of Rome. The networks continue to evolve and adapt, and the influence continues to flow through channels that remain largely invisible to public view. Whether this hidden governance leads us toward a more just and sustainable future or towards something else entirely may depend on our collective ability to understand and engage with questions of power, accountability, and democracy that we've only just begun to explore. The story of the Black Pope reminds us that in our interconnected world, the most important influences are often the ones hiding in plain sight, working through mechanisms we take for granted, shaping outcomes through processes we rarely examine. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of all. In an age when power can be both everywhere and nowhere at once, understanding how influence really works may be the key to ensuring that it serves the future we all hope to build together. The man in black requires no crown because his power transcends any throne. He needs no army because his influence operates through willing minds. He seeks no spotlight because his work is most effective when it remains unseen. And in that quiet effectiveness, in that patient cultivation of global influence, we find perhaps the most sophisticated expression of power our world has ever known. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the hidden corridors of influence. If you found this exploration thought-provoking, please subscribe and share it with others who might be interested in understanding how power really operates in our modern world. Because sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we're not supposed to be having. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop looking beyond the obvious answers to find the deeper truths that shape our shared reality.